We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Tesam and Aleph and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 79a. On the previous summit, the Mishnah said that if the disqualification of the carbon toda, if it happens bakodesh in the holy, what that would mean is, for example, let's say the person at the time of the shchita, at the time of the slaughtering of the carbon toda, he has in mind for outside the proper time, to consume it outside the proper time, or to consume it outside the proper place. So then the disqualification is essentially happening at that time, the time of the shchita. So then we say the kiddush alechem, then we say that the bread of the carbon toda is in fact sanctified. It might have the status of pigul, it might be disqualified, but it is in fact kiddush, it is in fact kadosh rather, it is in fact holy. However, let's say the psul, the disqualification happened earlier, for example, it was slaughtered, and it turned out it was a treifa, so then in that situation, lo kiddush alechem, the bread is not going to be sanctified, and the Gemara in the previous summit said that this is in line with Rabbi Meir's understanding of the Mishnah, and the Gemara in the previous summit brought a brisa, and the brisa so far essentially says the exact same thing as the Mishnah said, and the brisa continues, shachta v'nimsas balmum. Let's say he slaughters the animal and it turns out to be a balasmum, not balmum, balasmum. Let's say it turns out to have a blemish. And again, in this situation, really, it should have been the same as treifa. It should have been that lo kiddush alechem. However, over here, there actually was a machlokas tanoim. As Rashi explained on the previous summit, the reason for the machlokas tanoim is because we're talking about a blemish that is a small blemish, like in the cornea of the eye, and there is an opinion that in such a situation, if the animal is brought up on the mizbeach, it does not come down, and so that's why there is a machlokas tanoim, as the brisa continues exactly like the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer says, kiddush, that the bread is sanctified. Rabbi Yoshua Omer lo kiddush. Rabbi Yoshua says that it's not sanctified, and all of this entire first part of the brisa, divrei Rabbi Meir, are the words of Rabbi Meir, and what that essentially means is that Rabbi Meir, the version that Rabbi Meir has, is exactly the same as our Mishnah. And the brisa continues now with another version. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer of Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, they do not argue al sheshachta v'nimtzas treifa, in a situation where somebody slaughtered it and it turned out that it was a treifa, shelo kiddush. There's no machlokas over there. Certainly, it is not sanctified. V'al chutz lizmano shekiddush, and in a situation of having intention to consume the carbon outside the proper time, it is sanctified. V'al balmum shelo kiddush, and on a situation of balmum, let's say it turns out to have a blemish, lo kiddush, it is not going to be sanctified exactly like treifa. That is not like our Mishnah. Again, in our Mishnah, it's a machlokas by balmum. V'al ma nechleku, what actually is the machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua? Al chutz lemekomo, they're arguing, let's say the person slaughtering has intention to consume it outside the proper place. That's where there's a machlokas. Rabbi Eliezer Omer kiddush, Rabbi Eliezer says it is sanctified, the bread is sanctified. Rabbi Yoshua Omer lo kiddush, and Rabbi Yoshua says the bread is not sanctified. And the brisa continues and elaborates. Amar Rabbi Eliezer says, Hoel v'chutz lizmano pasul, v'chutz l'makomo pasul. If intention outside the proper time is disqualified, and intention outside the proper place is disqualified, so they should be the same. Machutz lizmano kiddush, just like by intention outside the proper time, it is sanctified. Af chutz l'makomo kiddush, so too outside the proper place, that kind of intention, it should still be sanctified. That's the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer. Amar Rabbi Yoshua says, Hoel v'chutz l'makomo pasul. We can argue as follows. Since the intention outside the proper place is disqualified, uval mum pasul, and balmum, if it has a blemish, it is disqualified. Ma balmum lo kiddush, just like by a balmum, it's not sanctified. Af chutz l'makomo lo kiddush, so too chutz l'makomo, intention outside the proper place is not sanctified. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, so Rabbi Eliezer said to him, he said to Rabbi Yoshua, ani demisiu l'chutz lizmano, I'm comparing chutz l'makomo to chutz lizmano, v'ata demisu levalmum, and you're comparing it to balmum. Nira l'midoma, why don't we see which one it's more similar to? Im doma l'chutz lizmano nidonenu michutz lizmano. If it's similar to chutz lizmano, we should learn it from chutz lizmano. Im doma lebalmum, and if it's similar to balmum, nidonenu mi balmum, we should learn it from balmum. And so Hischel Rabbi Eliezer ladun. So therefore Rabbi Eliezer began to analyze the matter. Done in psul machshava mi psul machshava. We should learn a disqualification about intent from something that has to do with intent. Ve'in done in psul machshava mi psul haguf. We should learn something that has to do with intent from something that's a psul haguf, like a situation of a blemish. And Hischel Rabbi Yoshua ladun. Rabbi Yoshua began to analyze. Done in psul she'ein bo kares. We should learn a disqualification that doesn't involve kares. Mi psul she'ein bo kares, from something else that doesn't involve kares. Chutz l'makomo does not involve kares, and also balmum doesn't involve kares. V'al yochiach chutz lizmano shepsul sheyesh bo kares. We shouldn't bring a proof from chutz lizmano, which is something that does involve kares, because that's a situation of pigul. V'yoden further, nidonenu mishalo lishmo. We should learn from shalo lishmo. Let's say one does it not for its sake. He slaughtered slaughters the animal, shapsul machshava, that is a psul of intention, ve'ein bo kares, and there's no kares over there, and so we should learn from over there. Everybody agrees that in a situation of shelo l'shmo, it's not sanctified, and so too by chutz l'makomo, it should be not sanctified. V'shazak Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer was silent. And the understanding over here is that Rabbi Eliezer was silent because he accepted Rabbi Yeshua's position that lo kiddush halechem, that the lechem, the bread, is not sanctified. And the Gemara continues for Rabbi Meir. Now, according to Rabbi Meir, that again the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua was specifically by the case of Baal Mum. Let's say it turns out that the animal has a blemish. So the Gemara asks, Ma'ishna shachta v'nimtzas treifa. What's the difference between if he slaughters the animal, again by the carbon toad, and he finds that it's a treifa, to have a psulo kodem shchita? There the disqualification is before shchita, and that's why everyone agrees over there by treifa that lo kiddush alechem, that the bread is not sanctified. U'ma'ishna shachta v'nimtzas balas mum. So what's the difference between that and the case where he slaughters the animal and it turns out to have a blemish? To lo have a psulo kodem shchita, that there the psul is not considered to be a disqualification before the shchita, meaning to say that really should be the same thing. It should be considered also a disqualification before the shchita, and it should be obvious that lo kiddush alechem, that the bread is not sanctified. That makes sense with Rabbi Yeshua's position. But how does Rabbi Eliezer explain his position that in that situation kiddush alechem, that we say the bread is going to be sanctified? And the Gemara continues and answers, B'doken Shaba'ayin, we're talking here by, again, the cornea of the eye, a small blemish, V'alibad Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Eliezer is simply following Rabbi Akiva's position, and this was mentioned on the previous Amud, D'amarim olu lo yerdu, the Rabbi Akiva says, this was mentioned in Rashi on the previous Amud, the Rabbi Akiva says, in a situation of a minor blemish, so if the animal is brought, if the parts of the animal that are supposed to be burned on the Mizbeach are brought up on the Mizbeach, so then they don't come down from the Mizbeach, since it is just a small blemish, and so therefore, since im olu lo yerdu, it's not such a significant mum, that's why Rabbi Eliezer would say as well that kiddush halechem, that the bread is going to be sanctified. Now, what does Rabbi Yeshua respond to that? For Rabbi Yeshua responds to that, Ki Amar Rabbi Akiva, im olu lo yerdu, when does Rabbi Akiva say that if it goes up, it doesn't come down from the Mizbeach? That's bipsula degufe, that's with the disqualification in the animal itself. Aval lekadushe lechem, but in terms of sanctifying the bread, lo itmar, it was not stated over there, and that's why Rabbi Yeshua says lo kiddush halechem, even if it's true that olu lo yerdu, but still lo kiddush halechem. And Rashi Ksav explains, Doken Shava'ayin, again, it's an injury to the cornea of the eye. Uvechihai muma, in such a blemish, Amar Rabbi Akiva says, Imalu lo yerdu, that if it ascends the Mizbeach, it doesn't come down from the Mizbeach. Hoel ve'ein mumo nikar, since the mum is not recognizable. V'yo diksherim ba'ofos, furthermore, such a mum, such a blemish is still kosher when it comes to bird karbanos, she'ein bahen chisar and aver, because by birds it's only by chisar and aver, it's only missing a limb, that's considered to be a blemish. And Rashi continues, V'idach, the other opinion, now this is a different girsa than the girsa we had in the Gemara. In our Gemara, the girsa is Rabbi Yehoshua. What does Rabbi Yehoshua respond? And again, the Gemara said Rabbi Yehoshua responds, that's only true by the carbon itself, but not by the bread. But Rashi's girsa is v'idach, because it could also be going on Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says, according to everyone, according to both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, lo kiddush halechem. Rabbi Yehuda amar lach, Rabbi Yehuda will say to you, ki amar Rabbi Akiva, malu lo yerdu. When did Rabbi Akiva say if it goes up, it doesn't come down? That's legufe de zevach, that's for the animal itself, the carbon itself. But in terms of sanctifying the bread, it doesn't have such a strong kedusha, and therefore again the bread is not sanctified. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, was stated the following machlokas amoroim, chatas sheshachta chutz lezman, if you have a carbon chatas that's slaughtered with intention to consume the carbon outside the proper time, im also lo teiret, so if it goes up on the Mizbeach, it does not come down from the Mizbeach. And Rashi Ksav explains, sheshachta chutz lezmana, im also lo teiret, damrina b'Meseches nida b'perak yotzei dofen, we say Meseches nida in perak yotzei dofen, Torah achas l'chol ha'olam, there's a general law for everything that ascends the Mizbeach, im olu lo yerdu, if it ascends, it does not come down, so that's a general halacha by shachta chutz lezmana. And the Gemara continues, but chutz l'mekomo, what about if it's intention outside of the proper place? So here we have a machlokas amoraim, some reverse the girsa, but we will read it with the girsa that we have Rava Amar Teired. Rava says that Chutz L'Mekoma is different than Chutz L'Zmana. By Chutz L'Mekoma, it does come down from the Mizbeach. And Rabba Amar Lo Teired. Rabba says, no, it does not come down from the Mizbeach. It's exactly the same as Chutz L'Zmana. And the Gemara continues, Rava Rabbi Yoshua. Rava seems to be following Rabbi Yoshua above. This is in Rabbi Yehuda's version of the Machlokas Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer. Again, in that version, the Machlokas was by Chutz L'Mekoma. Rabbi Yoshua said, Lo Kidesh Alechem, and Rabbi Eliezer said, Kidesh Alechem. And the Gemara said the whole Machlokas is, do we learn Chutz L'Mekoma from Chutz L'Zmana? By Chutz L'Zmana, it is Kidesh Alechem, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer says we learn from Chutz L'Zmana, we say Chutz L'Mekoma is also Kidesh Alechem. And again, Rabbi Yoshua says, Lo Kidesh Alechem, because we learn Chutz L'Mekoma not from Chutz L'Zmana, but rather we learn it from the case of a blemish, of a mum, and again, in Rabbi Yehuda's version, by the situation of a mum, it is certainly Lo Kidesh Alechem. And so that's why the Gemara is saying, Rava Rabbi Yoshua. Rava follows Rabbi Yoshua because Rava compares the case of Chutz L'Mekoma to a case of a blemish. By a blemish, there we say it is Teired, it does come down from the Mizbeach. Rabba Rabbi Eliezer, but Rabba says like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabba says Lo Teired because he compares Chutz L'Mekoma to Chutz L'Zmana. And then the Gemara says V'Hadr Bei Rabba L'Gabe de Rava, and then Rabba actually retracts his position and ends up agreeing with Rava. Midahadr Bei Rabbi Eliezer L'Gabe de Rabbi Yoshua, because we said Shasak Rabbi Eliezer, that Rabbi Eliezer also retracted to the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua. But the Gemara continues, V'Ika D'Amri, there are those that say, Afagav D'Hadr Bei Rabbi Eliezer L'Gabe de Rabbi Yoshua, even though Rabbi Eliezer retracted his position to Rabbi Yoshua, but still Rabba L'Gabe de Rava Lo Hadr Bei, but still Rabba did not retract to Rava in this case, even though again Rabbi Eliezer did retract. And what's the reason for the difference? Because Hasam Hu D'Kamar Le, because there, what was the final argument of Rabbi Yoshua to Rabbi Eliezer? He said, Nidonenu Mishalo Lishmo, we should learn it from a case of Shalo Lishmo. By Shalo Lishmo, everybody agrees Lo Kiddush Alechem. Let's say the carbon todas brought Shalo Lishmo, then the bread is not going to be sanctified. So Rabbi Yoshua said we should learn from there, and Rabbi Eliezer was silent. But over here, if you apply that same logic, Idayin to lay Mishalo Lishmo, if you're going to try to learn it from Shalo Lishmo, actually it would just support that position. Im also Lo Teired, that would mean that by Shalo Lishmo, if it goes up, it does not come down from the Mizbeach, and so essentially that really is the same as what Rabbah said, that Lo Teired, it does not come down from the Mizbeach. And Rashi Ksaviyat explains, Rabba Rabbi Yoshua, again, Rabba goes like Rabbi Yoshua, the Medamale LeBal Mum, he makes a comparison to Bal Mum. Ubal Mum Amrin on Hasim and Mala Yerid, by Bal Mum, it does come down from the Mizbeach. The Katani, it says over there, Yachol Shanimar Behorovea Vanir Bad Marbani Eselu, Shepsulan Bakodesh, Umotziani Eselu, Sheim Sulan Bakodesh, that's what the Gemara says over there. And Rav Amar Lo Teired, Rav says it doesn't come down. Rabbi Eliezer, he follows Rabbi Eliezer. The Medami Leil, Chutz L'Mekomo, the Chutz L'Zmano, he compared Chutz L'Mekomo to Chutz L'Zmano. But then the Gemara said you can make a distinction, Aval Hacha, but over here, he dying to lay Chutz L'Mekomo Mishalo L'Shmo, even if you do learn Chutz L'Mekomo from Shalo L'Shmo, Imala Lo Yered, if it would go up on the Mizbech, it would not come down. To Achatas Sheshachta Shalo L'Shmo, by Achatas that is slaughtered, not for its sake, Afilu L'Rabba, even according to Rabbah, Im also Lo Teired, if it goes up on the Mizbech, it doesn't come down. Hoel B'shar Karbonos, Ola L'Chatchila, since by other Karbonos, if it wasn't a Chatas, it actually would be Ola L'Chatchila. The halach is by other Karbonos, not a Chatas, if it's Shalo L'Shmo, even though it doesn't satisfy the obligation of the owner, but it still is kosher to be brought on the Mizbeach, and so therefore, by the case of Chatas as well, we are going to say him also Lo Teired. And of course, we will note over here that Rashi Ksaviyad has Rabbah and Rava reversed in the Gemara in terms of their positions, and that's why it's Rabbah that's like Rabbi Yoshua, and Rava that's like Rabbi Eliezer. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Shachta Shalo L'Shma, if one slaughtered the Toda not for its own sake. And similarly, the Mishnah went on to say, if the Shlamim ram of the Miluim offering or the two communal Shlamim lambs of Shavuos, if they were slaughtered not for their own sake, the bread is not going to be sanctified. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Papa says, Shavak Tana di Don El Nazir de Shchiach. Our Tana abandons the case of the Nazir's ram, and that's a common offering. V'nokat El HaMiluim, and instead chooses to mention the case of the ram of the Miluim. That was just a one-time offering. And the Gemara explains why. V'tana di Don, our Tana, Iker Mil Sanaka, chose the original case of an offering that was accompanied by bread. That's why the Tana chose that case. And Rashi Ksaviyat explains, Iker Mil Sanakat Miluin Karvit Chila L'chala Karbanos. The Miluim were the first Karbanos ever brought. The Karban Yachidu, and that's a carbon of an individual. V'huadin le'el Nazir, and the truth is the same would be true by the El Nazir, by the ram of the Nazir. Lishna Achrin, another understanding of what the Gemara is saying, Miluin Karban Sibor. Miluin is a communal offering. V'kisvei Atzeres Karban Sibor, and that's the same as the lambs of Atzeres, and that's why that was chosen. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Hanisachim shekitchu b'kli, if you have Nisachim, that's libations, and they were consecrated in a kli shares, v'nimtza zevach pasel, and then it turns out that the sacrifice that the Nisachim are accompanying, it turns out that that is pasel, that is disqualified. Im yesh zevach acher, so if there is another sacrifice that is in need of Nisachim, so yakrivu imo, so then they can offer the Nisachim with that sacrifice, with that carbon. V'im lav, and if not, so then yifsalu belina, so then they'll be disqualified. They're rendered unfit by remaining overnight. That's what should be done with the Nesachim. And the Rashi Ksav Yad has a slightly different girsa at the end of the Mishnah. Hachi Garsin, and the proper text is Imlanu. If they are left overnight, then Yifsulu Belina, then they'll be disqualified Belina by being left overnight. And the idea is that they have been consecrated in the Klishares, and therefore once they have that Kedusha, if they can't be used for anything, so they will be disqualified when they are left overnight. And the Gemara says, Amar Zeiri says, Ein hanesachim miskadchen ela b'shchitas hazevach. Nesachim libations, they're only consecrated through the slaughtering of the animal. That's the animal that's being brought as a carbon together along with the nesachim. And the Gemara says, my time, and what's the reason for that? Amar Kratz, because the pasuk says zevach u'nesachim, it says a sacrifice and it's nesachim, and zevach implies slaughter, and therefore again it's the slaughter of the animal that's mekadesh the nesachim. And the Gemara continues to now, we learned in our Mishnah, hanesachim shekitchu b'kli, if you have libations and they're consecrated in a vessel, v'nimtza zevach pasel, and it turns out that the animal that's slaughtered is disqualified. Im yesh zevach acher yikruvu imo, so if there's another animal that should be brought together with the nesachim, v'im lav, but if not, yifsalu belina, so then they'll be disqualified, meaning the nesachim are disqualified when they are left overnight. And so therefore the Gemara says, my lav is it not? The ifsul b'shchita isn't the disqualification of the animal. It took place by the shchita, by the slaughtering, so there was no slaughtering, and yet we're saying the nesachim are in fact kadosh. They do have that kedusha from the kli shares because they're disqualified belina. And so therefore we see it's not the shchita hazevach that consecrates the libations. It's possible that the libation will be consecrated in the kli shares. And the Gemara continues and says, lo, no, the ifsul bezrika, it's possible that our Mishnah is talking about a situation where the disqualification of the animal, it happened after the slaughter, meaning to say it happened at the time of the zrika, the throwing of the blood, and so therefore, again, at that time there was a disqualification, and it was consecrated through the shechita. And the Gemara continues and says, Keman, who does this follow? Kerebi, it seems to follow the opinion of Rebbe. This is referring to a machlokus between Rebbe and Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon by the Shtei HaLechem on Shavuos. The Shtei HaLechem on Shavuos, those two loaves on Shavuos, they're connected to the kvasim, the lambs that are brought on Shavuos. And there's a machlokus over there, whether the Shechita alone consecrates or whether also the Zrikas Hadam. And so this seems to be following Rebbe, that the Shechita alone. Diyamar Shnei Devarim Hamatir, and when you have two things that are permitters, talking about the Shechita and the Zrika, so malin zeh below zeh, they can cause to ascend one without the other, meaning the shechita alone is able to consecrate, and that's going to be true by the libations as well. And the Gemara continues and says, Afilu Tamer Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, you can even say that our Mishnah is following Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. Again, Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, he argues with Rebbe. He says that when there are two things that are matirin, they can elevate the sacrifice only together. But Hachabim and here what are we dealing with? Kagon Shekibel Daman Bekos V'nishbach. The case is one receives the blood of the sacrifice in a cup and it spills on the ground. And Rashi Ksav Yad explains, Keman Mekadsha Shchita L'chudeh, according to whom do we say that the Shchita alone is Mekadesh L'nesachim, is Mekadesh the libations? Kirebi, that would follow Rebbe again by the Shtei HaLechem. Diyamar Shnei Dvarim Hamatirim, if you have two things that are permitters. Kagon Shchita Zrika, for example, slaughtering and throwing the blood, Malin Zeh below Zeh, they're able to elevate one without the other. Diyamar Beperak HaTcheles Shachat Lishmon, he says that let's say the Shchita was done Lishmon, V'zorak Daman Shalo Lishmon, and the blood was thrown Shalo Lishman, so really only the shechita was done properly. But halechem kadosh, v'eno kadosh, the lechem is holy, it's not fully holy. And again, that's explained earlier, but the point is there is kedusha. The shechita alone can create that kedusha. And then the Gemara said, Afilu Tamer Rebbe Elazar, you could even say in Rebbe Elazar, the Amar Liolam eno kadosh ad sheyishchet lishman, v'yizrok daman lishman. He said there's only kedusha by, again, the shtei halechem, if the shechita is done lishman and the zrika is done lishman. The shnei devarim hamatir and shechita uzrika, when you have two things that are permitters, shechita and zrika, zrika, the slaughtering and the throwing of the blood, hamatir and labasar, they are the permitters of the meat. Ein malin zebelozeh, they don't elevate one without the other. Mishum dehave zrika psula, because it's a zrika that is disqualified. Kagon shenizrak hadam shelo lishman, for example, if the blood is thrown not for their sake. V'hachen, over here, kagon shenishbach hadam bekarka, the case is that the blood spilled out on the ground, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Tes Amid Beis.